Welcome to Ask the Experts. I'm Jill Schlesinger of MoneyWatch.com. I'm joined by Mr. Otter here to my right.
That's me, executive editor of MoneyWatch.com.
And we have a special guest star. It's the Federal Reserve episode because we had to bring on someone who actually knows something, right, Jack?
So Ben Bernanke is going to be on the show?
Yes. Well, we were going to have Ben Bernanke, but he was busy, so we figured Mark Thoma would be better. Hi, Mark. Welcome.
Nice to be here.
There it is. Let me give you Mark's bio. He's a macroeconomic guru. How about that?
Yeah,
that's pretty good. Yeah. A time series econometrician at the University of Oregon, his research focuses on how monetary policy affects the economy. So kind of like a good guy to have on the program today. Yeah. So, Mark, right now we're on pins and needles waiting for the Fed to speak. What do you think is going to happen today?
Well, I wish they would go to QE3, but I think there's too much fear of inflation for them to actually expand their balance sheet. So my best guess is they're going to do what people call Operation Twist, which is simply to shift the duration of their portfolio. They'll sell short-term assets, buy long-term assets, and the hope is that will drive down long-term interest rates and stimulate the economy.
And will it?
Well, it could have some effect. First, there's not a lot of room for interest rates to move downward. And then you have to wonder, even if interest rates do move downward, how much investment and consumption will that prompt people to do in such a depressed economy? And so it's a non-risky move because you don't expand the balance sheet. There's not as much inflation risk, but because you've lowered the risk, you're not going to get as much bang for the buck, so to speak.
And ordinary Americans who aren't going out and shopping for a house, how will that affect those folks?
It should lower the price of refrigerators, cars. If they're on a variable interest rate, then they have any sort of long-term interest rate, it ought to lower that as well. But the average person hopefully will see indirect effects, particularly unemployed, by increasing demand and increasing employment.
But will it? I mean, like really marginally, but like, what does that mean to us? Like, talk to me. I'm like the regular guy. Like, what is that really going to mean to me? I'm not going to I am still in debt. I don't have any money in savings. I'm scared to death that I'm going to lose my job. Am I going to really act any differently?
I don't think so. I don't think I can promise anyone that this is going to have a great big effect. My own view is the Fed is doing the minimum it can do to look active and take some of the political pressure off. Though it's getting political pressure from the other side yesterday.
Right.
But they're trying to just do what they can do to walk a fine line here and look active, but not take any big risks. And so I don't think we're going to see a big effect from this, but it's certainly worth trying.
Oh, I'm kind of telling you something. I'm kind of depressed right now.
Well, I think it's interesting that Mark said they're doing the minimum they can to appear to be busy or whatever. And here we had this letter that Mark wrote about, urging them not to actually even take the step. Is there any economic logic behind the Fed not doing Operation Twist, or is it purely a political move?
I think it's purely a political move. I think the Fed has room to do more. They can do more with very little risk. The big worry seems to be an inflation risk. But with an Operation Twist, you're not changing the size of the Fed's balance sheet. You're just trading the types of assets that you're holding. And so they're not creating any inflation risk from that operation. And so it's not clear what the Republican Congress people are worried about.
In terms of putting money in people's pockets, now we always talk about all the people who are underwater on their homes, who can't afford a home and so forth, and that's all serious stuff. But the vast majority of homeowners actually probably are equity positive, right?
Sure. I mean, it's just and only a quarter of those with mortgages are the ones that are underwater. But if you throw everyone in, sure.
So would there be an option here for people to refinance? I'm thinking about it, although I'm actually shortening duration, not putting more money in my pocket. But could we potentially see people refinance, have more money in their pocket, go out and spend, and create a little more demand?
Certainly, that's one of the intents of this program, is to bring down those long-term rates and create those kinds of opportunities. Again, when you look at the numbers and the number of people who are likely to refinance and those sorts of things, when you start putting all these things together, we'll get some people buying new refrigerators, we'll get some investment out of it, not a lot. You get some refinancing, not a lot. I'm not saying this won't have any impact at all, that people won't see anything, but I'm just arguing that these effects are all going to be moderate, but when stacked all together, they'll add up to something.
And Jack, you mentioned the letter that the Republicans sent to the Federal Reserve. I'm sure the Fed loves getting mail from politicians. It must be some of among their favorite notes. So can you just go into a little bit of detail about what those Republicans said to the Fed? They basically said, back off, or we're gonna make sure you what? What was that?
Well, I guess the make sure you is the scary thing here. Obviously, the Fed is supposed to be politically independent. I think no matter whose side you're on, if you look at the long term, you have to think that a Fed that makes its mistakes honestly rather than getting pushed in one way or another by politicians is going to be a better Fed. I mean, at the moment, as Mark pointed out in his column, that there's the danger that the Fed will take this Operation Twist and look as if it's sort of doing the Democrats' bidding. But the big picture here is, should the Fed ever do any politician's bidding? And I think politicians have stresses on them to get reelected, to get money from PACs and so forth, that the Fed is free of. So I hate seeing them do that. The details are that John Boehner, John Kyle, and Eric Cantor said, please don't take this step to transfer assets to longer dated treasuries and from shorter.
Mark, what was their rationale for that? I mean, just because we said so?
They seem to be worried about inflation risk. So they seem to be saying, look, we don't see any positive effects from this. Now, I think you can see positive effects if you look, but their opinion is the data doesn't suggest there's any positives from it, and there's only negatives. There's the inflation risk. But from my perspective, if you look at the history of when monetary policies become politicized, the minute you start putting monetary policy in the hands of politicians, you tend to see more inflation than you do with an independent central bank. So it's a bit puzzling to me how it is that you politicize the Fed and take away the inflation risk, when most countries seem to believe that the way to minimize inflation risk is to make the Fed as independent as possible.
And when we talk about the Fed, I mean, the real reason the pressure's on, Mark, is that pretty much that Congress is not going to do anything, and as a bunch of PhDs, I think that certainly the Fed would prefer it if this was a congressionally mandated kind of spending to spur economic growth. But are they left with this idea that there's just nothing else that Congress is going to do, and so they better do something?
Yeah, I think Ben Bernanke's last speech made that clear, that he would really, really, really like to see some help from fiscal authorities. And if they're not going to help him, at least don't work against him by doing significant deficit reduction in the short term, which would actually reduce demand. The Fed is left in the position, I think, of believing, look, the fiscal policymakers aren't going to do anything. They might work against us. We have to try something. What can we do without taking a lot of risks? Because I've got a committee here that's split. I've got some inflation hawks. I've got doves. What can we do that sort of walks the middle ground? And that's why I think everyone's settled on this Operation Twist, which is a bit of a middle ground that everyone, at least at the Fed, can get aboard.
Yeah, I want to ask the more boring question. I was talking to a White House official off the record, because anything good has to be off the record, right? And I said to him, so we're talking about the debt and we're talking about the deficit, and now you've got a bunch of guys sending letters to the Federal Reserve. What happened to jobs? What happened here? How did we had this jobs program that was announced, which was, some proposals look like they're political. Some look like they're intentional for some good. This may be something in between those two. How did jobs just get tossed aside for these two debates, these other issues, which really are not going to create 14 million new jobs anytime soon?
I wrote the same thing yesterday. I was really disappointed that Obama came out with a speech on the deficits following the footsteps of his talks on job creation, because it really buried the job creation message. And I think now everyone's back on debt reduction, debt reduction, debt reduction. From my perspective, the very biggest problem that we face is the unemployment crisis, and Congress ought to be focused on that particular problem. But they are reading polls and letting the politicians, I think, drive policy more than the economists. And the polls are telling that people are more worried. I don't know if this is true or not, but I think they've got the perspective that it's true, that people are more worried about the deficit, so they seem to be focused on that problem. But I just think it's the wrong problem to focus on right now.
And can you just, can we back up and do a reboot on history? What could the stimulus have done differently? The first stimulus, let's admit it was too small, and and everyone had underestimated how deep the recession was going to be. But could there have been a different way to craft that stimulus program to create more jobs?
Very much so. The first thing I would have done, and I don't think this was politically possible, but setting the politics aside, the 40% tax cuts probably wasn't the best option for job creation. Mm-hmm. The other thing we learned from the ARRA is that stimulus spending on infrastructure doesn't have as high of a labor ratio to capital ratio, as we call it, as we thought.
Translation.
It doesn't create very many jobs per dollar spent.
Really?
Because a lot of it's on equipment. But you could have picked jobs that were highly labor intensive. There's different labor intensity. They picked jobs that had the most, picked projects that had the best long run economic growth. I think they could have also had an eye towards the ones that create the most jobs. And if we redo an infrastructure program, I really think they ought to put that high priority. Some projects create a lot of jobs, some don't, and the job creation didn't rise to the forefront when they were doing the choices.
Do you think that, Jack, pop in here, I'm totally hogging this, I'm sorry, but do you think at that time, talking about what was politically possible, again, looking back in time, could they have gotten more than they got, or was that really going to be a problem? I mean, the 800 and something billion, could that have been a larger number, or was it going to be a threshold up to $1 trillion? Like once it went over a T, that was going to be too much for Congress?
Oh, me or
you?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you.
Hey, you big shot with a red tie. You put a tie on for a reason today, didn't you?
I was waiting for Jack to answer. My apologies.
So
I honestly don't think that they could have gotten a bigger package through. I think we very much needed a bigger package, but politically, I think they did the best they can. So given the political constraints, I'm not at all convinced they could have gotten a bigger package. That's not to say we didn't need it.
Okay.
Mark, we're operating on a premise here that not everyone agrees with. So I just want to step back and have you address that. First of all, the idea that any jobs were created by the stimulus. I know the CBO has said that I think somewhere between 1 and 3 million jobs were created. But some people just attack the very idea the government is capable of creating jobs. Could you address that?
If you look at the employment figures when we did the census, there's a huge spike in the employment numbers. It's obvious that census spending, which is government spending, created jobs. I don't think you can have any doubt about that. That was a very targeted, very narrow, very large spending, so you can see it in the numbers very clearly. But as econometricians, time series econometricians like me, go back and look at what happened in the past with government spending and do our best to statistically tease this stuff out, we find that government spending does in fact create jobs. Now there's some controversy about the size of what we call the multiplier. If you spend $1, how much job creation do you get out of that? Is it more than $1 worth? Is it less than $1 worth? But the fact that there's job creation at all, I don't think is controversial among economists. It is a political controversy that's risen, but not an economic controversy.
Okay, now I'm sorry. You go.
Let me qualify that. There's a big difference between being at full employment when the economy is humming at full employment. In that case, you really don't create jobs when you government spend. When you create these census jobs, they come from somewhere else. They stop working as stock people at Safeway and they take the better census job that might have benefits or something like that. So you just translate jobs. When you have a high degree of unemployment like we have now with unemployed resources, you can employ those unemployed resources through government spending and have a net job creation that you don't get at full employment.
So, Mark, the economy grew by 0.7% in the first half of the year. And now we just had, yesterday, the IMF, which, by the way, always late. They tell you what you know 6 months later. So bless their hearts. I'm glad that they put papers out and all that. But so the IMF says the U.S. growth rate this year is only going to be 1.5%, right? And so I wonder from your perspective whether you think that's on target. If we've only had 0.7% in the first half, we know that July and August were probably a bust after the debt ceiling because everyone was freaked out and frozen. So are we going to talk about the last 4 months of the year, we're going to grow by 2.5%? What's going to get us up to 1.5%?
One of the problems I have with policy to date is they keep seeing green shoots right around the corner. And I've been complaining about this for 2 years. Green shoots. So tomorrow things are going to be better, so we don't have to do any policy today. Whatever the forecast is, and I think it's a fairly dismal forecast, I don't think we're going to see 2.5% growth the rest of the year, but whatever the forecast is for the Fed and for others, they need to take seriously the possibility that we're going to stay in a sluggish growth economy and take the actions they need to take now to insulate against that. Because if we make a mistake where we do too much, I think that's far less of a mistake than doing too little at this point in time.
How? And by the way, doing too much, I mean, I know inflation is up, but why are we making this like people are talking as if we are in double-digit inflation, that all of a sudden we have become the Weimar Republic and, like it costs twice as much for a loaf of bread tomorrow as it did yes. I don't understand how this has gotten out of control.
I think there are a couple of things. One is the very things that have gone up in price are the prices of which we are most aware. So with gas, it's the only thing we buy where the number is 8 feet tall on a sign. So everyone feels that. Some grocery items have gone up a lot, so people feel that. There's also a wonderful political opportunity here. How do you attack the people who are in power? Well, clearly jobs is one, but then you get them on inflation too. And somehow it sounds sort of liberal and tax and spend, and that's associated with inflation. And Volcker, of course, saved us from that years ago. But finally, where am I going here with this,
I don't know. It's just great. They're all bad.
They're absolutely all bad. But there are people like James Grant. And you know what? Mark could actually pass for sort of a distant cousin of James Grant, even without a bow tie.
Yeah.
And here's a guy who I don't think is trying to make political points. He's a heck of a smart guy. Mark, what is the strain of economics that James Grant and others like him who really worry? I mean, first of all, he's long-term. So clearly he's not suggesting there's inflation tomorrow, but for him, 10 years isn't that far away. So what is his argument, and how much credence do you give it?
Okay, what's happened is we used to think if you just increase the money supply massively, that would turn into inflation. What we didn't really understand, I don't think, is sometimes that money just piles up in the banks. And that's what's happening right now. The Fed has increased the money supply, it's piling up at banks, and it's piling up at corporations. The two different views are how quickly, whether the Fed can get the money back out of the banks faster than the banks can loan it out when things get better. They used to just have one tool to do that, which was open market operations. And if they just had open market operations, I'd be just as concerned as James Grant and everyone else that they can't reverse this quick enough. They gave themselves a second tool during the crisis, which is paying interest on reserves. If there's a big inflation threat, the Fed can raise that interest on reserves and freeze that money in the bank. If they're paying you 5%, why would you loan them out 4%?
Right.
It would be silly. And with that extra tool, it makes me much more confident that they can hold that money in the bank and take it out as slowly as they need to take it out without creating an inflation risk. But it really comes down to, can they get it out of the banks faster than the banks can loan it out?
And do you think right now the problem with the banks is, there's sort of this great argument of the banks not lending just because they're freaked out in general, and that's what happens after a credit crisis? Or is it just people aren't borrowing as much?
I think it's lack of demand. I think there's plenty of supply there. I know some people tell us the second thing I think they might do today is lower that interest rate on reserves from 0.25%, maybe to zero, maybe cut it in half. The idea is, well, the Fed, this is opposite of what I was just talking about. Now they'd be more likely to lend because you've lowered that rate. But again, going from 0.25 to zero, I just don't think that creates enough of an incentive. And I think there's a deficient demand, and demand is really the big problem. And we need to get investment demand up to make this work.
How do we get companies to spend some of the $2 trillion that's sloshing around? Are there incentives, and can it be whether through the tax code or through monetary policy that would really encourage them to do something? Or do they just have to say, we're waiting till Greece is done, or we're waiting till the European Union breaks up?
The answer is you can do it both through monetary policy and fiscal policy. Monetary policy lowers long-term interest rates. As we were talking earlier, that creates incentive. You led the horse to water, you hope it drinks. You can also create those same incentives by tax code. You could create exactly the same increase in profit you get from reduction in interest rate by lowering taxes. You could also do what some countries have done and actually penalize companies for sitting on these massive reserves. Now, that's not going to be very politically popular.
No, thanks.
But if you really wanted to get that money out of those corporations, if you tax them for sitting on that money, that's probably going to create an incentive to invest. What you don't want them to do, though, is just go out and invest in projects just because they have to, and then create another sort of a credit problem where they're not going to be able to pay these bills off later because they've made bad investments. So you have to be careful with these incentives so you don't cause people to do things they don't really want to do.
Do you think that, I know this is like probably very bad to do. This is sort of like what's hot, what's not of People magazine, but let's do it for economists. So are you a fan of Bernanke? I mean, do you heart him? Would you friend him on Facebook? Are you Facebook friends? Let's be honest. Come on, come clean right now, Mark.
No, we're not quite Facebook friends, but if he asked, I certainly would.
Oh, big deal. Me too.
I'm actually fairly supportive. I think he's done about as much as you can do. He's been very creative in what he's done. I know there's a lot of pressure to do more, and a lot of people believe that it's his decision alone. But he's got, 12 people that need to vote. Actually, only 10 with 2 missing positions. But he's got 10 people that need to vote on this policy, and he needs to bring them all along. And that's a very difficult job when you're as split as the FOMC has been. But I am very convinced that the Fed hadn't done a lot of the special facilities and special programs they did early, that we would have seen a much more massive financial breakdown post-Lehman, and that things would have been much, much worse than they were.
And of course, politically, that's a rough position to take. Like if, say it's like Obama coming out and saying, listen, had I done no stimulus, it would have been way worse. And like, it's sort of hard to prove the negative. But I don't know. It seems to me. See, I'm a contrarian in every way. The more that people don't like Bernanke, the more I actually feel bad for the guy and think, well, you know what? It can't all be him. And it does seem, especially Republicans who are running, are really on this bashing the Fed thing. And it sort of feels a
treason.
Little...
Treason word.
Yeah, I mean, it's treason, but it's even not that crazy. But there always seems to be this undertone that, like, he's done something horrible to us, as if, you know what I mean? It just seems so unfair, actually.
The scapegoating, I think, it comes with the territory, and I think you kind of have to expect you're going to be scapegoated a little bit by one party, the other, no matter what you do. But the directness of the pressure coming from committee chairs, coming from the Congress, coming through formal letters, it's the directness and the explicitness of these calls for the Fed to do more or less. I think that's very different now. And I think the Fed really does feel constrained by the threats to its independence that it's feeling right now. And I think that's just a mistake that's being made politically.
And what's funny about this is, remember Greenspan in the 90s. He could do no wrong. He was the oracle.
See, and I hated him then.
Of course
See,
you did.
that, I hated that.
Yeah.
I felt like that was such baloney.
Yeah.
And of course, I felt like, I never liked that whole story about the guys beating up on the women who started raising questions. That always made me nuts, and he was part of that.
Oh,
the
really?
whole Brooksley Born thing always made me very uncomfortable. So we actually do have a Fed announcement that is out, and it appears to be that the Fed has kept rates at 0 to 0.25%, and they are going to buy $400 billion of longer-term treasuries by the end of June of 2012. And Mark, they're going to sell an equal amount of shorter-term treasuries. So come on, baby, the twist is on.
That's Operation Twist. 400 billion, is that enough over 12 months? What's that, about 30 billion a month? That's a drop in the bucket in the financial markets. Was this going to make a big difference? It's going to make a little bit of difference. I would have liked to have seen a more aggressive, larger program per month. If I'm getting this right, 2012. Yeah, that's a year from now.
Yeah.
So a little more than I said, 50 billion a month, something like that. That's, just on the edge of making a difference.
And when you say make a difference, what do you think? I mean, when you say a difference, like give me a GDP, what percent of, is it a quarter of a point of GDP maybe? Sort of, kind of? No.
That's a big guess at best. Yeah, I'll give you a quarter. I'm not going to a half.
Man, you're something else. Okay, by the way, it's the Treasuries will have they're going to buy maturities of 6 to 30 years. They'll sell an equal amount of Treasuries with maturities of 3 years or less.
Any downside?
Last time they did this, they really didn't target the longer term. They really traded like 3 years for 6 years. I'd like to see them go out to the end of the spectrum more. Take the 3 month, sell them for 10, 20 years. I think the further you move from the middle, the more effective this is going to be. And
let me ask another question. Assuming that, let's just kind of say that 30-year fixed rate mortgages today, right this second, are trading at 4 1/8, 4 bid at a quarter, okay? Do you expect 30-year mortgages to drop below 4% as a result of this program?
I think they've already anticipated this move. This has been widely reported. All of us have been calling for Operation Twist, and so a lot of those rates have already factored this in. At least, 80%. So you'll get another 20. They were 80% sure, so they moved 80% already. You'll get another 20%, but I don't think we'll see a big drop. Okay, and the idea that the target range is now set, they did this at the August meeting, through mid-2013. Mm-hmm. How do you feel about that explicit date? Does that make a difference to you, or does it make a difference to the marketplace? It should. It's what we call an explicit commitment. And by making an explicit commitment, you're committing to allow perhaps inflation to rise above target in the short run. The idea is to make people just what the Republican were afraid of. You want to make people afraid of inflation. You want to have them expect inflation in the short run. Because if you're afraid prices are going to go up in the future, you'll buy more now. And it's as simple as that. And so the idea is by committing to keeping the interest rate low for that period of time, we'll create inflation fear in the short run, but in the longer run, we're going to promise not to create inflation. And so they're trying to get a short run impact through a short run inflation.
Kind of along those lines, is there any danger to selling these 3 years or whatever the shorter duration bonds? What are the possible unintended consequences of that move?
You end up, and I'm not going to be able to speak to this explicitly, but you end up changing the risk of the portfolio. And so the Fed's holding these assets, and they can have capital gains and losses just like anyone else. When they shift to the longer term, they're more subject to risk, and so they're risking the portfolio more through capital gains and losses. And that's the only real risk, because they're not changing the size of the balance sheet at all. So
but what about in the marketplace? Is there a danger if this should, well, first of all, could it push short rates up? And if so, would that cause any problems?
If it did cause problems, the Treasury has full authority to reverse this. One thing you have to worry about is twist. The Treasury can come right around behind them and just undo this by buying, selling exactly the opposite. So it's not risky in that sense, because the Treasury can monitor it and undo it if they want to. But no, I really don't think there's such a demand for safe assets right now throughout the world because of the problems in Europe and elsewhere, that somebody's going to be buying these short terms if it isn't the Fed. And so I don't really see any big problems that way.
You know, one thing we can say is if the government has to borrow money, and for at least a while it does, boy, just like mortgage holders, it's great they can lock it in at 3%, right?
Absolutely. But look, and the other question I have is, so really, this operation at $400 billion is not going to necessarily have any effect on short-term interest rates for folks who are net savers in this country, the people who are, it's hard to imagine that you're going to get, wow, there's a nice big jump up in your savings rate. I mean, you wouldn't expect that, would you, Mark?
I don't expect that. As sad as it is for those people who are relying on that, like my parents, who really wish they could go back on the road again on their motorhome, which is parked. But I just wish I had better news, but I don't.
Why can't you say something nice to your mother, for God's sakes? Can't you give her some good news? Who is, you know, it's a terrible. By the way, let's just talk a little bit about the action here and voting against the action. Your friend Richard W. Fisher. What do you like him or not? No, you don't like him, do you? Just tell the truth. No, I'm kidding. I'm totally kidding you.
Well, you're not kidding. Actually, you're accurate.
I know. Narayano, and you'll pronounce the last name.
Narayana, yes.
And Charles Plosser, who's been a pretty major league inflation hawk dude. Are these guys just going to say no the whole way through, no matter what? I mean, what are they seeing that the other committee members don't see? These are all PhDs, brilliant men and women. Of course, I would like to say that Janet Yellen, a fellow alumna of my university, she'd be my favorite. But that said, she's the dove. What do these three who voted against it, what are they afraid of? Are they just afraid of inflation?
Yes, two are PhDs, and they're worried that.
Oh, nice! I love that. Speaking of somebody who doesn't have an advanced degree, I love when you call people out like that. That's great. Okay.
They are worried about inflation risk, and Narayana's made that very, very clear in his recent speeches. He's more than willing to support the extended commitment on the interest rates, because he believes that once the Fed commits to something, it needs to honor it. Backing off your commitments is the worst thing you can do. But he's made it absolutely clear that he doesn't think any further easing will do any good. Now, part of the reason in his case is he thinks the unemployment problem is structural rather than cyclical. And so it's not that he doesn't think the Fed has powers. He doesn't think those powers will do any good because they can't do any good for the problem itself. Plosser is more directly worried about the inflation threat. And he's made that clear all along. And they simply don't think this tool, the interest rate on reserve, is going to be sufficient to stop the inflation problem. It goes right back to what we were talking earlier. Fisher's just an inflation hawk, and I can't really explain his hawkiness theoretically, but he's very much an inflation hawk.
And he's the one who's not the PhD?
Yeah.
You know what? I think that that's very good. I think we're going to out. We have to out him as such.
Yeah.
Absolutely, Mark. You know, I have to say that it's pretty downbeat to report and discuss the things that are going on, in the economy right now. And, oftentimes, when I'm hosting my radio show, people are like, can't you give me a little glimmer of hope? And it's hard for me to see it. Can you give me a glimmer of hope that I can pass on to regular people who are just watching this or trying to figure out, I have a job and I'm doing okay, but it feels like there's a big dark cloud hanging over us. Is that cloud going to stick around for a while?
The hope isn't the kind of hope I wish I had to give, but I really don't see any chance of a double dip recession. I think what we're in for is this very sluggish, a very slow recovery. So the people that are worried about a second dip, now it could happen. This is a probabilistic statement, but I'm not worried about that. So I think we're on a very slow recovery path. And then if we take the right steps through fiscal policy and monetary policy, we can help the economy recover a little bit faster. But historically, when we look back at balance sheet recessions, at financial crashes, you get lost decades. They're not inevitable, but they're very common. And the best hope is just that things aren't going to get a whole lot worse, and they'll just slowly get better.
Well, here's how I keep thinking when they talk about that lost decade, like, this time is different, right? So you look at that book and you come out of it and you say, oh, well, okay, so it's 7 to 10 years. So the best thing that I can think about is I think 8, 9, 10, 11, 4 down, maybe only 3 to go. That's all right. We're halfway done, maybe.
17 years. Because add that to the 10 years of the so-called lost decade, and you get kind of the cycle that Warren Buffett actually warned about in 1999. He said we've had 17 great years, and we could be in for 17 bad years. So, once again,
you know what? I got to tell you something.
2017, guys.
The fact that you just said that is a total buzzkill for me. 17. I wasn't thinking about that. 2017. I was thinking that maybe we would be at 14 or 15.
Oh.
You see what I'm saying?
Sorry about that.
Mark, you're a brilliant PhD and anything else you want to be. And thank you so much for joining us because, thank God, because what would we be talking about?
Yeah.
What about that Placer? What do you think going forward, Romney versus Obama, who's better for the economy?
I think Obama's better for the economy if he would stick to his guns and quit compromising.
Oh, yeah. Mark, why are you not on the federal? You should be on the open market committee. Why? There's 2 openings. Should we start a campaign for you online of some sort?
That would be okay with me.
Ah, nice. All right. Thoma for FOMC. Hey, Mark, thanks so much for joining us. You are fantastic as always. And Jack, really, he's smart and he talks about it.
He makes us look smart, actually, which is the best possible
Don't
thing.
go crazy.
Yeah. Well, go to MoneyWatch.com, read his column.
Yeah, read Mark's column, and he's so smart. Maximum utility. And, I have to say, Mark, it is such a pleasure always to have you on. And thank you for talking down to us. We appreciate it because, we're at the level of most users. And you should check out MoneyWatch.com, read Mark's column. Jack, anything else to say before we go? Happy Fed Day. Anything else?
Refinance. Yeah.
Refinance. Jack's going to do it. You should too.
Once in a lifetime. Yeah, we've said it over and
Okay,
over
wait a
again, but
second.
now we're there. Yeah, this is it.
Well, you can't go wrong. Put it that way. If they go down another quarter point, you're not going to kill yourself. So go refinance. If you're saving a lot of money, I got to tell you something. I'm thinking maybe buy some dividend producing stocks. At least have some stock exposure in your portfolio. I know everyone's freaked out and scared. Don't be so scared.
I did it. You recommended an ETF.
Yeah, it was a good one, right?
And sure enough, I'm up nicely. Listen to what Jill says.
Yeah, except he bought that other individual stock that's not doing so well.
You didn't tell me to.
I didn't tell you, but I was horrified when you told me that.
Okay, well, we always say at MoneyWatch, don't buy individual stocks. For once, I didn't follow our advice, and I paid for it.
Well, we'll see. You stick around. Go long, Thoma. Thanks so much, Mark. Appreciate it. MoneyWatch.com. We'll see you here next week for Ask the Experts. I'm Jill Schlesinger.
I'm Jack Otter.
And we'll check you out next week. Thanks for watching.